Good evening. It's a really genuine pleasure to welcome you to this evening's keynote address and the opening session of our conference to discuss how we should act on Pope Francis's call in Laudato Si on care for our common home, especially with respect to institutional investment practices and policies. I welcome both registrants for our conference and other members of the University of Dayton community and the wider Dayton region who've come to hear Dr. Colecchi's remarks tonight. My name is Paul Benson. I'm the interim provost of the University of Dayton and have been on the planning team for UD for this conference. We're particularly pleased and honored to have at the conference representatives of such a wide range of institutions, both within and beyond the Catholic world, and also to convene such a rich and diverse body of expertise, from leaders of religious congregations to university students, from chief financial officers to moral theologians, from healthcare leaders to journalists and media specialists, from climate justice activists to the directors of private foundations. This is a unique assembly. These sorts of representatives and institutions don't convene often enough to address the unique juncture at which we stand in human history. This diversity of institutional contexts, religious commitments, expertise, and experience is particularly valuable, I think, as we contemplate Pope Francis's call to confront what he identifies as one of the principal challenges facing humanity in our day, to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to work together in building our common home. Before we begin this evening's talk, I'd like to take a moment to offer three important sets of acknowledgments. First, I want to recognize our generous, enormously talented, and impressively committed partners in organizing and helping to fund this conference. The Wallace Global Fund, Franciscan Sisters of Mary, Green Faith, Healthcare Without Harm, and Arabella Advisors. A number of leaders and other representatives of these organizations and congregations will be speaking at various points in the conference this weekend. Second, I'd like to recognize the faculty and staff members in the university's Hanley Sustainability Institute, in media relations, in university advancement, and in our provost office, who have invested so much time in planning and facilitating this conference. In particular, thanks are due to Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and acting head of the Hanley Institute, Don Pear, and the Hanley Institute's administrative assistant, Monty Moyer. Don, who is where? Over here, will be making conference announcements periodically throughout the conference. You can go to Don with logistical questions you might have. And I think everyone who's registered for the conference by now feels that they have a close kinship with Monty Moyer, who's been managing communications and logistics. So please feel free to talk to Monty if you need to. Special thanks are also due to Jason Pierce, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Bob Brecka, Director of Research in the Hanley Institute, Scylla Schindel in Media Relations, Paula Sedaris and the event staff who will be organizing all of our gatherings, and Margaret Listjack in our office, in the Provost's office. Our president, Dan Curran, has been an avid supporter of this event and will be speaking to the conference attendees over dinner tomorrow evening. Third and finally, I want to offer a very special thanks to George and Amanda Hanley and the Hanley Foundation, who enabled us to launch the Hanley Sustainability Institute in September of 2014. George is an alumnus of the university and is a member of our board of trustees. And George and Amanda both are visionary philanthropists who are trying to maximize their impact on just climate solutions for energy poverty. They're great friends and champions of UD, and they've inspired many of us to do our best work on behalf of the common good of humanity and the earth. Before I introduce this evening's keynote speaker, I want to set the tone for our discussions over the next 2 days and the impetus for tonight's keynote by capturing just briefly the power, the scope, and the sense of urgency of Pope Francis's encyclical. The following video clip, which was produced this past summer by Religions for Peace, will, I hope, help to focus our attention on these central features of Pope Francis's call.
Pope Francis has released his encyclical calling all people to be good stewards of the earth as a call to action in the lead up to the UN Climate Summit in Paris in December.
The very fact that arguably the most important religious figure is addressing this issue highlights how enormously significant and important it is for all of humanity.
God gave it to us as a garden. We cannot bequeath it as a wilderness.
بحيث أن من قرأ القرآن تكون له نظرة على الكون، يعيش مع الكون كأنه جزء منه، ويقول ولا تفسدوا في الأرض بعد إصلاحها.
I commend His Holiness and all faith and scientific leaders here today for raising awareness of the urgent need to promote sustainable development and climate change.
The Pope makes it clear he's not a scientist, but at the very same time, he tells us all, listen to what scientists are telling us.
Science and religion are coming together. The more we understand about the world, the more amazing we realize it is. We can certainly unite to preserve this remarkable planet.
I think it's a tremendously rich times where we can see the interface of science and spirituality. And this for me is really hopeful.
The encyclical concludes with a multi-religious prayer. Every religious tradition has its own religious and spiritual resources to help us protect our common home.
اسلام تأکید زیادی بر حفظ طبیعت داره و حمایت از طبیعت داره.
ដូច្នេះហើយបានក្រុមប្រឹក្សារឿងពុទ្ធសាសនានឹងត្រូវតែរៀបចំដើម្បីដណ្ដើមសន្តិនិកគ្នាហើយថាពិភាក្សាគ្នាដើម្បីដំណោះស្រាយ
We are not the owners of the earth. We are stewards, have inherited the earth, and we have to keep it, to handle it over to the next generations.
In the weeks and months leading up to Paris, the religious leaders of all the traditions are going to be calling us to stand up, to take action, to make this historic change that lies before us.
This climate change issue has to be talked about in every church, every temple, every synagogue, and every mosque.
It's not one organization, it was not one unit, not one person. It's going to be combined effort from public, private, different industries actually going to solve this problem.
Pope Francis is imploring us to care for the earth in new kinds of ways. And I believe that as all of our interreligious leaders come together, the world will respond accordingly.
With the encyclical, Pope Francis has issued an urgent call to take action to protect the planet. Time to act is now.
It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Colecchi. Dr. Colecchi serves as Director of the Office of International Justice and Peace of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. The office provides staff support to the Bishops' Committee on International Justice and Peace, which coordinates the USCCB policy on international issues. He represents the Conference on International Issues and manages a staff of international policy advisors. Dr. Colecchi holds a BA from Holy Cross College, an MA from Yale University, and a D.Min degree from St. Mary's University in Baltimore. Among many other honors, he has received the Bene Merente Medal from Pope John Paul II. Dr. Colecchi has written widely on Catholic social teaching, social justice, political responsibility, Jubilee, and religious education. He is the author of A Leader's Guide to Sharing Catholic Social Teaching and In the Footsteps of Jesus, Parish Resource Manual on Catholic Social Teaching. The latter manual received the Catholic Press Association's First Prize Book Award in 2005 for an educational work. Dr. Colecchi's talk this evening is entitled Pope Francis, Climate Change Demands We Change Course, Change Ourselves. Please welcome Steve Colecchi.
I was very pleased to receive the invitation from Dr. Benson to offer the keynote address at this important conference. My understanding from the description just read, but also from my correspondence with you, that many types of Catholic institutions, including those related to healthcare, higher education, religious congregations of men and women, and social services have been invited to participate. And I know that ecumenical partners and other persons of goodwill committed to climate justice are here as well. Pope Francis's encyclical letter, Laudato Si', Praised Be, on care for our common home, is addressed to every person living on the planet. The Pope aimed to enter into dialogue with all people about our common home. While the scope of this conference is more focused, it is still very ambitious. It aims to bring together Catholic institutions in order to mobilize a common action in response to the unprecedented crisis facing our common home. To anyone familiar with the Catholic Church, or with James Joyce's famous definition of Catholicism, here comes everybody, just the fact that we are having this dialogue among diverse Catholic institutions is a major accomplishment. Together, we will explore the role of divestment and investment strategies in promoting the welfare of our planet and of its poorest people. I want to express appreciation to the conference's organizers. In particular, I'm grateful to the University of Dayton for hosting this conference devoted to acting on Pope Francis's call, divestment and investment in care of our common home. As most of us are probably aware, the University of Dayton was the first Catholic university in the United States to make a public commitment to divest fossil fuel holdings from its long-term investment pool. The university has literally put its money where its mouth is, and it has used its unique voice and credibility to engage other Catholic institutions and people of goodwill in a wider dialogue. This dialogue aims to move toward taking dramatic steps to create lasting change. The title, as you were just told, that I have chosen for my remarks is Pope Francis, Climate Change Demands We Change Course, Change Ourselves. This title was inspired by a line from the Holy Father's encyclical, and I quote, "Many things have to change course, but it is we human beings above all who need to change." End quote. Now, in faithfulness to my role as Director of the Office of International Justice and Peace for the U.S. Catholic Bishops, some of my remarks will explore the international implications of Laudato Si'. But I will also explore some issues that are closer to home, especially as they relate to investment and divestment strategies linked to climate change. My comments will explore three realms of activity: governmental, institutional, and personal. First, governmental. We have all heard the saying, think global and act local. But I would add that we also need to think global and act global, and think local and act local. In a world that is profoundly interconnected, the local-global distinction is blurring, especially where the common good of ecology is concerned. Local actions have global consequences, and global action or inaction can have profound local consequences, especially for poorer communities and nations. Climate change does indeed demand that we change course and change ourselves. The crisis has profound implications for all of us, including for our lifestyles, our consumption patterns. But allow me to focus first on the need for our nation and world to change course, a change that will require courage on the part of government leaders. Pope Francis made no secret, as you heard in the video, of the fact that he hoped the publication of his encyclical this past summer would help encourage a positive outcome at the international negotiations coming up in December at the 2012 Paris Climate Conference, also known as the Conference of Parties, or COP21. He hoped that it would be successful where some other previous conferences were not. Noting that climate is a common good belonging to all, Pope Francis expressed support for the very solid scientific consensus that relates to climate change and the need to make changes in lifestyle, production, and consumption in order to combat this warming, or at least the human causes which produce or aggravate it. The Pope, of course, is speaking as a moral and spiritual guide, not as a scientist or a politician. But he speaks out of a Catholic tradition that lifts up faith and reason as apprehending the same one truth, if from different disciplines. As you heard in the video, science and religion are not opposed to one another. True faith and true science are allies in the search for truth and for the protection of our planet and its peoples. The Holy Father acknowledges that on many concrete questions, the Church has no reason to offer a definitive opinion. She knows that honest debate must be encouraged among experts while respecting divergent viewpoints. But we need only to take a frank look at the facts to see that our common home is falling into serious disrepair. He goes on to lament that our immense technological development has not been accompanied by a development in human responsibility and values and conscience. The message of Pope Francis in Laudato Si is about facing reality and accepting responsibility. Sea level rises, increases in extreme weather events, more frequent droughts, the spread of tropical diseases, the disappearance of species, adverse impacts on agriculture and on plant and animal life, all have profound implications for our planet and its people, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable members of the human family. In his encyclical, Pope Francis repeatedly points to the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of the planet. He argues powerfully that today we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Pope Francis promotes an integral ecology, declaring unambiguously, we are not faced with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. Everything is connected. The Pope's emphasis on the intersection of concerns for ecology and poverty is actually reminiscent of a U.S. Bishop's 2001 statement, Global Climate Change, a Plea for Dialogue, Prudence, and the Common Good. In that statement, the U.S. bishops wrote, action to mitigate global climate change must be built on a foundation of social and economic justice that does not put the poor at greater risk or place disproportionate and unfair burdens on developing nations. For this reason, the Conference of Bishops is on record today supporting robust U.S. funding for the International Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund will help developing nations particularly the poorest countries, shift toward low-emission, climate-resilient development, and will help them to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. In this regard, the bishops are particularly proud of the work of our Relief and Development Agency, Catholic Relief Services, CRS. CRS is already working in some of the poorest communities in our world, building resilience to climate impacts and fostering sustainable development. It is a harsh fact that those who contributed least to the buildup of greenhouse gases are likely to suffer its worst consequences, especially in poor countries. 50% of the Green Climate Fund will help these countries develop and reduce poverty by adopting sustainable green technologies. 50% will help them to adapt to harsher storms and shifts in climate, for example, through better water management for drought-prone areas and the planting of more resilient crops. When Pope Francis addressed Congress earlier this fall, he argued that we need to put technology at the service of another type of progress, one that is healthier, more human, more social, more integral. He then expressed confidence, and I quote, that America's outstanding academic and research institutions can make a vital contribution in the years ahead. I just look around here. Perhaps some of the institutions represented here will make these vital contributions that our world desperately needs. My own hope is that our nation and other developed countries will make the investments necessary to allow developing countries to leapfrog over carbon-intensive modes of human and economic development. To develop on a very different path than we took. There is a modest precedent for this. I travel around quite a bit internationally, and I can tell you the development of cell phones has allowed many developing nations to leapfrog over the need to hardwire an entire country in order to establish telephone service. With ingenuity and generosity, couldn't our nation help others to leapfrog to more sustainable modes of development that reduce poverty and improve human flourishing? Wind and solar power are very abundant in many of the poorest countries of this world. Pope Francis is relentless in his focus on the poor. We should be as well. He declares that for poor countries, the priorities must be to eliminate extreme poverty and to promote the social development of their people. But then he adds, they are likewise bound to develop less polluting forms of energy production, but to do so, they require the help of countries which have experienced great growth, our country, at the cost of the ongoing pollution of the planet. We in the United States and other developed nations owe the developing nations of the world a debt. Our development has come at great cost to them and to us. The bill is coming due. Pope Francis actually speaks of an ecological debt owed by richer, developed countries that ought to help pay this debt by significantly limiting their consumption of non-renewable energy and by assisting poorer countries to support policies and programs for sustainable development. But instead of reducing poverty and paying the bill, some in the developed nations of the North want to simply reduce the number of people living in the South, as if this would solve the problem. In a direct challenge to this narrow focus, Pope Francis notes that instead of resolving the problems of the poor, some can only propose a reduction in the birth rate. To blame population growth instead of extreme and selective consumerism on the part of some is one way of refusing to face the issues, the Pope says. Overconsumption in wealthy nations is the primary cause of the historic buildup of greenhouse gases. Now, today, of course, developing nations are contributing significantly to the buildup, not to the historic buildup, but to the buildup today, and will need to find a different path with our help, hopefully. Fully funding the Green Climate Fund will give the United States one thing to put on the table at the negotiations in Paris in December. But our nation could also put on the table our commitment to a national standard to limit carbon pollution from power plants. Our bishops' conference supported a national standard to responsibly limit emissions to protect public health and to mitigate climate change. As I'm sure you're well aware, power plants are often located in poor neighborhoods, and their pollution is particularly harmful to children and to the elderly. The adoption of limits on carbon emissions would allow us to protect health, but also to exercise critical leadership in efforts to achieve a globally negotiated climate change agreement. As bishops from 5 continents, including the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, said in a recent appeal to the COP21 international negotiators who will gather in Paris, and I quote, "The world needs a truly transformational climate agreement, one that protects both the poor and the planet we all share." They acknowledge that the building and maintenance of a sustainable common home requires courageous and imaginative political leadership. Legal frameworks are required, which clearly establish boundaries and ensure the protection of the ecosystem. Pope Francis would agree. In Laudato Si, he wrote, "Reducing greenhouse gases requires honesty, courage, and responsibility, above all on the part of countries which are more powerful and pollute the most." Pope Francis also acknowledged that to take up these responsibilities and the costs they entail, politicians will inevitably clash with the mindset of short-term gain and results, which dominates present economics and politics. Government leaders will need a long-term view, and to get there, they'll need courage and support. Part 2, which is shorter than part 1, and part 3 is shorter than part 2, so. Second, institutional action. Now, what does all this have to do with Catholic and other institutional investors in the United States? A lot. Government leaders do not operate in a vacuum. Please forgive the pun, but to create a climate conducive to the success of global negotiations on carbon emissions, we must both raise public awareness and public support for such actions. The goal is clear. Our world, our nation, and each of us must reduce our carbon footprints. Pope Francis was very direct in his encyclical, and I quote, "We know that technology based on the use of highly polluting fossil fuels, especially coal, but also oil and to a lesser degree gas, needs to be progressively replaced without delay," end quote. What does this mean? Does it mean immediately abandoning the use of all fossil fuels? Not according to the Pope. He argues until greater progress is made in developing widely accessible sources of renewable energy, it is legitimate to choose the lesser of two evils and to find short-term solutions. But we still have to take the first thing the Pope said very seriously. How do we get our economy on a trajectory to replace fossil fuels without delay? It is not going to be easy. If it were, we wouldn't be here. In his encyclical, Pope Francis does not speak directly about divestment strategies, but he does maintain that a path of productive development could correct the present disparity between excesses excessive technological investment in consumption, and insufficient investment in resolving the urgent problems facing humanity. As we have already heard, he clearly supports moving away from a fossil fuel dependent economy as soon as possible, which in the long run clearly means support for divestment from fossil fuel producers. The Holy Father is very critical about the functioning of the economy and of the financial sector in this regard. He says, and I quote, "The economy accepts every advance in technology with a view to profit, without concern for its potentially negative impact on human beings. Finance overwhelms the real economy. By itself, the market cannot guarantee integral human development and social inclusion," end quote. He doesn't mince words. He says with more than a bit of irony, we need to read, this is a quote. I got to say this is a quote so people don't think I'm totally anti-market, but this is a great quote. "We need to reject a magical conception of the market which would suggest that problems can be solved simply by an increase in profits of companies or individuals," end quote. I could not have said it better, and that's probably why I'm not the Pope. That's true. He goes on to ask a very blunt question. The Pope says, is it realistic to hope that those who are obsessed with maximizing profits will stop to reflect on the environmental damage which they leave behind for future generations? Now, Pope Francis is not against the market per se, or against the creation and fair distribution of wealth. In fact, he says, if we look at the larger picture, we can see that a more diversified and innovative forms of production, which impact less on the environment, can prove very profitable. He also is very concerned that we create an economy that enables people to support their families in dignity. This means work. He says, in order to continue providing employment, it is imperative to promote an economy which favors productive diversity and business creativity. And I would add, it just can't be business as usual, though. Pope Francis laments that worldwide there is minimal access to clean and renewable energy and calls for developing sources of renewable energy. This requires investments in renewables. It demands a reordering of our financial investments in order to reshape an economy for a sustainable future. He says efforts to promote a sustainable use of natural resources are not a waste of money, but rather an investment that can create economic benefits. In 2013, the United Church of Christ became the first U.S. denomination to move toward divestment from fossil fuel companies. What I found particularly interesting about their divestment resolution were its reasons for action. The United Church of Christ saw divestment as a prophetic act that will foster public awareness of the incalculable damage being done by the fossil fuel industry and of the urgent need to drastically and rapidly reduce humanity's dependence on fossil fuels. Prophetic witness certainly has its place in urging humanity to take a sustainable path that preserves the planet for our children and our children's children. Others have pursued an engagement strategy. The Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility describes its approach in a 2015 publication. The ICCR has pursued an inside strategy to urge companies to plan, manage, and set carbon reduction goals necessary to bring about systemic and enduring change. They have employed shareholder resolutions and dialogues with management teams. Interestingly, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility view inside and outside strategies as complementary and mutually empowering. not at odds with one another. I would observe that the Catholic Church is a big tent. Here comes everybody, under which both divestment and engagement strategies have their place. So there are a range of options opened to institutional investors in responding to the moral crisis of climate change. Prophetic divestment from fossil fuel companies, principled engagement with these corporations, and proactive investments in sustainable and renewable energy production. I'm reminded of St. Paul's image of the church as the body of Christ. For as in the body we have many parts, and all the parts do not have the same function, so we, though many, are one in Christ, since we have gifts that differ, each according to the grace given us. Let us exercise them, Paul says. That is the key. We must exercise our gifts. Our institutions must find the roles for which they are best suited. None of us or our institutions can remain on the sidelines when the future of our world and its people are at stake. There are, of course, other ways institutions can also act. We can become less fossil fuel dependent in our own facilities. We can become models for society, leaven and light in a world lying in the shadow of a climate crisis. For this reason, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops supports a bipartisan bill, the Nonprofit Energy Efficiency Act, introduced by Senators Klobuchar and Hoeven. This act will provide matching grants of up to $200,000 to help nonprofits, including parishes or educational institutions, social service agencies, hospitals, to make energy efficiency improvements, reduce operating costs, lower their carbon footprints. The for-profit sector has tax incentives. Nonprofits have no similar program. This legislation would create a public-private partnership to help our institutions invest in a more sustainable future. So we have looked at governmental and institutional action. Now we're in part 3, the shortest part. But now the shortest part is also the hardest part. Personal action. As Pope Francis notes, climate change demands we change course and change ourselves. The encyclical is not primarily about public policy or even institutional policy, although both are essential. He calls all persons, he calls each of us to conversion. He states, there can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself. His encyclical is a call for a change in lifestyle and consumption. His assertions are quite direct in this regard. Pope Francis states plainly that when people become self-centered and self-enclosed, their greed increases. The emptier a person's heart is, the Pope writes, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, and consume. It becomes almost impossible to accept the limits imposed by reality. I would say we become possessed by our possessions. There is a spiritual core to the climate crisis. Quoting Pope Emeritus Benedict, Pope Francis says, the external deserts of the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. For this reason, the ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. The Holy Father is asking us to look deep within ourselves, to see that we are full and complete in ourselves and in our relationships to self, to others, and to God. We do not need to fill our lives with things in order to be fulfilled. Governments and institutions will not be able to confront the climate crisis if people do not confront the crisis of the human heart. We must accept the fact that we need to live more simply in order to live within the limits of the renewable resources of the planet and to live in ways that do not harm its most vulnerable communities. But the encyclical is not only a call to live more simply, it is also a call to live life more fully. Pope Francis says Christian spirituality proposes an alternative understanding of the quality of life and encourages a prophetic and contemplative lifestyle, one capable of deep enjoyment, free of the obsession with consumption. Such sobriety, he says, when lived freely and consciously, is liberating. It's freeing. It's not a lesser life or one lived with less intensity. On the contrary, it is a way of living life to the full. In our hearts, we know this is true. In the words of Pope Francis, many of us today sense a profound imbalance that drives frenetic activity, makes us all feel busy in a constant hurry, which in turn leads us to ride roughshod over everything around us. A simpler life can be a fuller life, a life more anchored in relationships than in possessions. Climate change demands we change course and change ourselves. Faced with the immensity of this challenge, it would be easy to avoid it, to distract ourselves, to say it's hopeless, except it's not. Pope Francis assures us that things can change. The Creator does not abandon us. God never forsakes the loving plan and never repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. This is where faith comes in. Faith is not only our belief in God, faith is also God's belief in us. As we declare in the Creed each Sunday, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. We should never underestimate what the human spirit can accomplish under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. We are not alone. God has not abandoned us. God's love makes all things possible. With God's help, we can change course and change ourselves. Thank you. Yeah, I'll stay up here. You want to move? I have a mic built in.
Dr. Colecchi would be happy to take a few questions before we begin a reception, and I know he'd welcome conversation during the reception as well. Questions?
See, when you don't get hands raised right away, oh, we do have a hand. Oh, great. But that ruins my joke, which is, I either made it so clear that no one has a question or so murky they don't even know what to ask.
Do I need it? Okay. So I'm sure plenty of us in here would love to debate the issues of divestment versus principled engagement, but that is not where I'm going to go with my question.
Okay.
Given that we are a big tent and there's a diversity of views perhaps on divestment, nonetheless, we are called to address poverty, social justice, and the climate crisis as an integral crisis and as an integral opportunity. Right. So could we envision Catholic institutions committing to put a percentage of their investments into scaling up safe and clean energy around the world to address energy poverty? And could we imagine the U.S. Catholic bishops taking a stand on energy access in that way and calling upon Catholic institutions to put their money in the dual challenge of poverty and climate change with investments in energy access.
We can, and the bishops have, as well as the Holy Father. I mean, I think that's clearly the call of Laudato Si, and clearly the call of the 2001 statement on climate change that the bishops made. And I take your point. I know you didn't want to ask about the investment divestment, but I think it needs three. I think we need a church who can get the public's attention through divestment, who can get corporations' attention through engagement, and that can invest in renewable energy and in the development of poor communities, and particularly helping them to leapfrog, as I described, to new modes of development. And I think we need to do all of those things. And you know how Paul at one point says, because I'm not a hand, I'm not a foot, I can't say I don't need a hand, I don't need the foot, I don't need the head. We need all of the parts. And so I think all of those strategies are quite legitimate, and they complement one another, which is why I mentioned the thing from the United Church of Christ.
Hi, Cutler Cleo, Boston University. Thanks for a great start to the meeting. To follow up on this point, you won't ask about it, but I will explicitly. So, in terms of the engagement with corporations, so scientists tell us we need to leave 60% of the proven reserves of fossil fuels in the ground if we're going to stay below 2 degrees centigrade, which we now also know is not actually, it's worse than that, but let's just assume that's right. So, how do you engage the fossil fuel companies?
Well, I don't do that, but the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility does. And the ask is to diversify your sources of energy. The ask is to use the profits that you're currently getting from oil or gas, and to use and to diversify into wind and solar and research and new energy sources and sustainable sources and so forth. And in fact, many of those companies are actually heading down that path. They know that their ultimate future doesn't lie in the ground.
Well, I don't buy that at all. And, you know, there's not a single horse and buggy company that went into manufacturing cars because they weren't built for that. And, you know, you look at the websites of the oil companies and the coal companies, and they have their wind turbines up there. Go to their 10Ks. Look at where the investments are actually going, and the amount of money they're pouring into upstream development of fossil fuels is 99.9% of what they're doing. So, you know, one really has to wonder whether or not
you're making a good argument for employing the divestment strategy. I think that's a perfectly legitimate argument. I know of some very smart people who are employing a different strategy than that, and I think they're allies. I don't think they're enemies.
I've got a question. Hi. I do have the mic. So I get to ask whatever I'd like.
You can.
Well, thank you for a compelling call to action. My name is Bruce Boyd. I'm with Arabella Advisors. So you referenced the leadership of the University of Dayton with respect to its divestment commitment. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of Catholic institutions who've made a similar commitment. So what do you think we need to do to build the momentum within the Catholic community to see that the University of Dayton is not an outlier, but a leader that many Catholic institutions are following?
You know, I think this conference is a perfect first step in that, right? Because other universities were invited. This is going to lift up the strategy that University of Dayton has employed. I think it's interesting. I had lunch just yesterday with a friend from Georgetown University in Washington, and they, if I understood it correctly, I think they've decided to divest from coal, but not to immediately divest from oil and gas, as a way of shifting away from the most heavily polluting. I think that's a reasonable initial step. I mean, everybody knows that ultimately there has to be divestment from from most fossil fuels until we get to a level where the fossil extraction can be absorbed by a renewed Earth that's capable of absorbing. You know, we'll never have a zero fossil fuel emission economy unless we decide to give up air flight, or unless we can figure out how to do solar panels on planes that can actually make them fly. But clearly we cannot have this overly dependent 99.9% of our economy energy production based on, and other countries have taken great strides. In Germany has really moved into the renewables. We haven't. As a nation, we've got a crisis. So do we need more Catholic institutions on board? Absolutely. We need a lot more institutions on board. And we need a government that's willing to make some hard decisions. And we need courageous politicians. I don't want to let them off the hook, because they can create the climate in which renewables will be much more attractive economically.
Other questions? Sister Maureen?
The bishops meet in just a few days, actually.
They do.
Is climate change in any way on their agenda for this meeting?
What was really interesting is that the bishops got ahead of the curve on this one. It was on their agenda in June. They knew Laudato Si was coming out, and so there was a presentation by the two chairmen to the entire body of bishops in June by Bishop Thomas Wensky, the Archbishop Thomas Wensky of Miami, who's the domestic chair, and Bishop Oscar Cantu, the chair of the international committee that I work with. And they did a joint presentation to all of the bishops outlining the main themes that we anticipated in Laudato Si, outlining strategies for engagement, and so on and so forth. We also did a separate workshop for bishops, which had about, maybe 40 bishops attend, which is a lot when it's just an optional, you have to arrive early to come to it. So we had about 40 bishops that did that. We're doing ongoing engagement with the bishops. The Catholic Climate Covenant, Dan Miesla is here from the Catholic Climate Covenant, did events around the country with key bishops in key areas to outline. So there was an event in Miami that dealt with sea level rise, and one in Norfolk that I think also focused on that, and also on security threats that arise from climate change. But the local bishops were involved in these. And then you did one in Iowa, and where else? Cincinnati, Chicago, Sacramento. So anyway, the bishops are engaged, and they're going to continue to be engaged. But yes, I don't think they don't normally in back-to-back meetings do the same topic twice. But we did do it in a very big way in June.
Hi, my name is Charlie. I'm a grad student at Xavier studying sustainability. But my question is, there's two interrelated parts. One is the government and the military are arguably always decades ahead in terms of technology. Mm-hmm. So the first part is in relation to that, how can we transition or encourage the government to hand over some of the technology that they might have already developed for the purposes of the common good. And the second part is, 55% or so of our tax dollars go to the military. And how can we, which is related, right? So how can we transition or divest, encourage divestment from putting our finances into the military-industrial complex and transition to ways that are more socially just and have a positive impact for the whole world?
That's an excellent question. In fact, as you know, we've been in a perennial budget crisis the last several years in this nation. And one of the things the bishops have been very strong on is to reduce unnecessary military spending. I mean, we spend as much as the next 15 countries combined, and most of them are our allies. I mean, there is an imbalance, clearly, in the budget. In terms of technology, what's really interesting is that both governmental and military technologies have in the past robustly contributed to our economic growth, surprisingly. And I would expect that we could expect that in the renewable energy area, the government will be very forthcoming. Part of the problem is they've been, I think, a little underinvesting in this. One thing, the military would actually be an ally on this. The military has done an analysis that they consider climate change to be a threat multiplier, big time. And they want to, in fact, that was the part of the event, I think, that was in Norfolk, right? In Norfolk, Virginia, where they have one of the largest naval base on the East Coast, the military speaker talked about how it's a threat multiplier and how, therefore, and in fact, the military also support development assistance for poor countries because that's a stabilizing effect in poor societies. So both the need for development and the need to reduce carbon emissions in order to reverse climate change are things that, from a strategic military standpoint, actually make sense. And so I think there are potential allies within the military community on those issues. And yes, we've got to get our budget priorities straight.
Hi, I'm Dom Sanfilippo. I'm a senior at UD studying human rights. Dr. Colecchi, thank you for a wonderful keynote. My question is, can you give a sense of the conference's glimpse into the congressional reaction and congressional awareness of Laudato Si after it was released
sure.
this summer, and just sort of speak toward how Laudato Si is making its mark on the Hill in the different offices and sort of in the consciousness of Congress?
Sure, I'd be happy to. In the immediate wake of the publication of Laudato Si, in fact, the day it was released and then the next day, myself and another colleague did briefings in both the House, the Senate, and at the White House. They were very well attended. A lot of interest on the Hill in Laudato Si. So that's one issue. What's also been interesting is since the Laudato Si has raised the profile of the issue, there actually was a resolution introduced by some conservative Republicans saying, you know, conservation is a good Republican value. We need to address climate change. And that wouldn't have happened. I think the Pope created some political space for some more moderate Republicans to come out and be supported. Of course, and we've even seen a couple of bipartisan initiatives be introduced. I mentioned one of them, the Nonprofit Energy Efficiency Act, which was actually a little before the Pope's encyclical. But there is also another one that is going to work on reducing carbon pollution. And so I think it'll be very hard for Congress to try to roll back what the president has done with the EPA national standards for carbon emissions. That might get challenged successfully in court. I don't think there's any chance that Congress will be able to reverse it because the dynamic has really changed in Washington. People are starting to pay attention to this. Now, there are still huge problems in Washington, D.C., which is why I'm really glad I actually live in Alexandria, Virginia, and commute in. But anyway, no, I mean, problems are not solved. There's still that, we're largely paralyzed by partisan politics, but I do believe, and part of that is, let me just say a word about that, and this will be the last piece here. Our politics are broken because, in a sense, the country is a bit broken. That people are in their own sort of news ghettos, right? So I only watch certain networks, or I only go to certain websites that match my political view. And because of that, on both the left and the right, it's increasingly difficult to get them to trust each other and to even understand each other. It's really a problem. We don't have the great senators and representatives who could easily cross the aisle and get something done. We need to work on that as a nation. We've got to get out of our ghetto and get to know the other, people who disagree with us.
Let's take one last question if we could. I think back there, Don.
A nice, easy softball question at the end of the night would be really great. Actually, I'm just filling space until he gets over there.
Thank you. I'm aware of higher educational institutions like University of Dayton that have divested and come out publicly on this, as well as women's orders.
Yes.
But I haven't heard anything from the diocesan community, and I'm curious what you're seeing there, whether the dioceses are also moving in this direction to divest and what positions they may or may not have taken at this juncture.
You know, I'm actually not familiar with what dioceses might be doing. I know a number of dioceses have socially responsible investment screens on their investments and that kind of thing, and I do know the environment and pollution and so forth are part of those screens. But whether that has moved the diocese to actually do a divestment strategy, I honestly don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. But it's going to take all of us in our own personal lives, in our institutional lives, and in our citizenship with our government leaders. We can't solve this at one level. I noticed we didn't get any questions on the what I thought was the hardest part of the talk, which is, you know, in order to change course, we have to change ourselves. So I'll just leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Before we proceed to the reception, just a couple of announcements for conference attendees. The conference schedule is available not just on the web, but through the guidebook app. So if you want some instructions about how to access that app, please let us know. Secondly, breakfast tomorrow morning begins at 8:15 in the room just across the hallway here, the Marshall Room. The first session of the conference begins at 9 a.m. back in this room. There may be a little wet weather tomorrow morning, so if you have an umbrella or some other kind of covering, please look for that. And thanks again for being here, and then please enjoy the reception and engage Steve Colecchi and others in conversation. Thank you.